The foundations of Andean civilization were laid millennia before the Inca Empire's rise. Human presence in this demanding region dates back to at least 15,000 BC. This was when nomadic hunter-gatherers first ventured into the high mountains, following the retreat of glaciers at the end of the last ice age. These early inhabitants left behind stone tools and cave paintings, hinting at their struggle for survival in this harsh yet resource-rich environment. A profound transformation began around 5000 BC with the domestication of native plants. The potato, capable of growing at altitudes where few other crops could survive, became the cornerstone of highland subsistence. More than 4,000 varieties would eventually be cultivated across different ecological zones. Simultaneously, farmers domesticated other vital crops. Quinoa, with its protein-rich seeds, nutritious legumes, and hardy tubers like oca and ulluco, became staples on the coast and in lower valleys. Maize, chili peppers, beans, and cotton also became essential. This agricultural revolution allowed nomadic bands to settle into permanent villages, setting the stage for increasingly complex societies. Ceremonial centers emerged along Peru's northern coast approximately 5 millennia ago, indicating the development of social hierarchies and specialized religious activities. The remarkable urban center of Caral, in the Soup Valley, appeared around 2600 BC. Contemporaneous with the Egyptian pyramids, its inhabitants constructed large platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and residential complexes designed to house thousands. Notably, this sophisticated civilization developed without ceramic technology. Instead, they created musical instruments from animal bones and textiles from local cotton. Caral and similar centers emerged not through conquest but through trade networks linking coastal fishermen with highland farmers. The first millennium BC saw a transformative religious movement centered at Chavín de Huántar in the north-central highlands. For nearly 7 centuries, spanning much of the first millennium BC, the Chavín culture disseminated powerful religious iconography featuring composite beings that merged human features with those of jaguars, eagles, and caimans. The site's labyrinthine stone temples channeled water through hidden passageways, creating haunting reverberations that enhance ritual experiences. This spiritual tradition unified diverse communities through shared religious practices rather than political control, establishing patterns of pan-Andean cultural exchange that would endure for millennia. As Chavín's influence diminished during the Late Iron Age, distinctive regional cultures flourished across the Andean landscape. Throughout the period spanning from late antiquity to early medieval times in Europe, the southern coast became home to the Nazca people, creators of immense geoglyphs. These enormous ground drawings of animals, plants, and geometric forms stretched across the desert plateau. These massive figures, some extending more than 1,200 feet, were created by removing the darker surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. Their purpose remains debated, but they likely served astronomical, religious, and social functions. Nazca artisans also produced exquisite polychrome pottery featuring naturalistic and mythological imagery, demonstrating their keen observation of the natural world. The early centuries of the Christian era saw the Moche civilization flourish along Peru's northern coastal valleys. For over half a millennium, they built impressive adobe pyramids, with the largest, the Huaca del Sol, requiring an estimated 143 million adobe bricks for its construction. Moche ceramic art represents one of humanity's most remarkable artistic traditions, with vessels shaped as portrait heads capturing individual likenesses with astonishing realism. Their pottery also depicted detailed scenes of warfare, ritual combat, hunting, fishing, and explicit sexual practices. Metalworkers developed sophisticated techniques for gilding copper with thin layers of gold, creating objects of dazzling beauty that signaled the growing importance of precious metals in Andean ritual and political life. While these coastal societies flourished, equally significant developments occurred in the highlands. During the time when Rome's influence was waning in Europe, The Tiwanaku culture emerged near Lake Titicaca and would dominate the southern highlands for the next 7 centuries. Their engineers developed raised field agriculture. Artificial planting platforms separated by water-filled channels that created microenvironments, protecting crops from frost. This innovative system produced surplus food in a region where conventional farming would be nearly impossible. Tiwanaku's architectural achievements included precisely cut stone buildings, monolithic gateways carved with intricate iconography, and extensive water management systems. Their influence spread throughout the southern Andes through trade networks rather than military conquest. In the middle of what Europeans call the Dark Ages, the central highlands near modern Ayacucho witnessed the emergence of Wari culture. Unlike their predecessors, the Wari expanded through direct territorial control, establishing administrative centers across much of Peru. Their approach to imperial management, including standardized architecture, ceramic styles, and settlement planning, prefigured strategies later employed on an even grander scale. Wari cities featured distinctive orthogonal layouts with high-walled compounds enclosing residential spaces, suggesting concerns with security and social control. Their rapid expansion relied on sophisticated road networks connecting provincial centers with the capital. Throughout these centuries, metallurgical innovation accelerated across the Andes. Bronze tools enhanced agricultural productivity and construction capabilities. Craftspeople mastered techniques for working gold, silver, and copper, creating spectacular ornaments for elite individuals that symbolized their connection to cosmic powers. Textile production, considered the most prestigious art form, reached extraordinary levels of sophistication. Using backstrap looms, weavers created complex fabrics with up to 300 threads per inch, incorporating intricate patterns and symbols that conveyed information about status, ethnic identity, and spiritual beliefs. When European knights were departing for the First Crusade, both Wari and Tiwanaku experienced decline and eventual collapse for reasons still debated. Perhaps climate change, resource depletion, or internal social tensions undermined these early states. Their fall ushered in a period of regional fragmentation lasting several centuries. Smaller polities competed for resources and prestige, sometimes through open warfare. The northern coast saw the Chimu kingdom establish its capital at Chan Chan, an immense city of adobe compounds covering nearly 6 square miles. In the highlands, various ethnic groups controlled strategic valleys and passes, developing distinctive cultural traditions while engaging in complex patterns of exchange and conflict. This era of fragmentation produced innovations crucial for later developments. Agricultural terracing expanded significantly, transforming steep mountainsides into productive farmland while controlling erosion. Irrigation works grew more sophisticated with canals carrying water across challenging terrain to nurture crops in naturally arid zones. Storage facilities, both for food and water, became increasingly important for managing seasonal variations in resource availability. These technological and administrative solutions to environmental challenges provided essential foundations for imperial expansion. The peoples who preceded the Inca developed remarkable cultural adaptations to diverse environments, stretching from arid coastlines to frigid mountaintops. They mastered water management in one of Earth's driest deserts, created monumental architecture without draft animals or metal tools, and established long-distance exchange networks traversing some of the planet's most challenging terrain. Their agricultural innovations allowed dense populations to thrive in seemingly inhospitable settings. Their artistic traditions expressed sophisticated understandings of the natural and spiritual worlds. And their organizational achievements, managing labor, resources, and knowledge across dispersed communities, created templates for the more centralized systems that would follow. When a small ethnic group began expanding outward from their homeland in the Cusco Valley during the early 13th century AD, they did not create Andean civilization from nothing. Rather, they inherited millennia of cultural knowledge, technological innovation, and social organization. The genius of their imperial project would lie in synthesizing these diverse traditions, adapting proven techniques to new contexts, and implementing earlier experiments in governance on an unprecedented scale. As their origin myths acknowledged through supernatural imagery, they were both heirs to and transformers of an ancient and sophisticated cultural world. In the fertile valley of Cusco, nestled high in the central Andes at over 11,000 feet above sea level, the story of a great civilization begins not with archaeological certainty, but with sacred narratives. These origin myths, passed down through generations of oral tradition before being recorded by Spanish chroniclers, reveal how this highland people understood their own beginnings and divine purpose in the world. The most widely recounted origin story tells of 4 brothers and 4 sisters who emerged from a cave called Tampataco, meaning House of Windows, at Pacarac Tampu, about 20 miles south of Cusco. Led by Manco Capac and his sister wife Mama Aclo, they journeyed northward in search of fertile land. Carrying a golden staff, Manco tested the ground at each resting place. When they reached the Cusco Valley, the staff sank into the earth, signaling they had found their home. Here, Manco Capac taught men agriculture and governance, while Mama Aclo instructed women in weaving and household management. Thus began the divine lineage that would rule the Andean world. A parallel tradition describes Manco Capac and Mama Aclo as children of the sun god Inti, sent from an island in Lake Titicaca to bring civilization to humanity. They emerged from the sacred waters carrying the knowledge of agriculture, weaving, and proper worship of the gods. This version emphasizes their divine parentage, reinforcing the royal rulers' claims to be direct descendants of the sun itself. These mythic narratives served crucial political purposes. They established the divine right of leadership, legitimized practices of sibling marriage within the royal lineage, and asserted their civilizing mission in the Andean world. The stories also reflected genuine cultural memories of migration, settlement, and the gradual development of agricultural expertise adapted to the challenging mountain environment. Archaeological evidence suggests a more complex reality beneath these mythological origins. During the 12th century AD, as regional polities throughout the Andes competed for resources and influence in the post-Wari landscape, a small ethnic group established themselves in the Cusco Basin. They were initially just one of many competing chiefdoms in the region, distinguished neither by size nor technological superiority. Their homeland occupied a strategic location at the intersection of several ecological zones, allowing access to diverse resources from different altitudes. This position offered advantages for trade and alliance building that would prove crucial in their subsequent rise to prominence. The historical record identifies Manco Capac as the first recognized leader of this nascent society, possibly ruling in the early 13th century. Whether he was truly a single historical figure or a composite of several early leaders remains uncertain. What seems clear is that during this formative period, the foundational social and political institutions that would later facilitate expansion began taking shape under Manco Capac and his immediate successors. They established the practices of divine kingship, created the first royal lineages known as panicas, and laid the groundwork for their distinctive approach to governance. The hereditary succession that followed Manco Capac established what chroniclers would later call the dynasty of the early kings. These rulers, Sinchiroca, Locupanqui, Maida Capac, Capac Yupanqui, Inca Roca, Yahuahuacac, and Viracocha, gradually extended their influence throughout the Cusco Valley over approximately 2 centuries. Each sovereign built upon the achievements of his predecessors, consolidating control over nearby lands and forming alliances with neighboring ethnic groups. These early kings were not yet emperors but rather local leaders, slowly increasing their regional prominence. During this pre-imperial phase, the foundational elements of Cusco's society took shape. The Ayla system, extended kinship groups that formed the basic social unit, organized community life and labor obligations. Each Ayla maintained collective ownership of land while also having specific ceremonial responsibilities. Marriage typically occurred within these kinship groups, strengthening social bonds while preserving access to ancestral territories. The household unit centered around a rectangular structure with stone foundations and adobe or stone walls, topped with thatched roofs, typically housing a nuclear family supplemented by extended relations. Gender complementarity characterized Andean social organization during this formative period. Men and women operated in parallel spheres of influence and productivity, each essential to community well-being. Women controlled food preparation, chicha, corn beer, production, textile manufacturing, and certain agricultural tasks. Men focused on field preparation, construction, and craft production. While men predominated in formal political positions, women of high status wielded considerable influence, particularly through control of cloth production, the most prestigious art form in Andean culture. This complementary system would later be reflected in the dual male-female leadership that characterized many aspects of imperial administration. Daily life in early Cusco revolved around agricultural cycles. Potatoes and other tubers formed the dietary foundation at high altitudes, supplemented by quinoa, meat from llamas and alpacas, and maize grown in the valley bottoms. The typical diet included chuno, freeze-dried potatoes produced through an ingenious process of freezing, trampling, and sun-drying, along with various stews and chicha. Clothing consisted of tunics called unca for men and wraparound dresses known as anaku for women, with variations in design and ornamentation indicating social status. Textiles incorporated geometric patterns and symbolic elements that conveyed information about identity and social position. Religious practices centered around the worship of Inti, the sun deity associated with the ruling lineage, but also incorporated veneration of Viracocha, the creator god, Ilapa, the weather deity, and Pachamama, the earth mother. Natural features, mountains, springs, unusual rock formations, were recognized as wakas, embodiments of sacred power requiring regular offerings. The Pleiades star cluster guided agricultural planning, while observation of solstices and equinoxes structured the ceremonial calendar. This early religious system already contained a cosmological framework that would later expand to encompass the entire empire. Under Viracocha, the eighth ruler in the traditional sequence, Cusco's influence extended throughout the valley and began pressing against neighboring territories. This expansion brought conflict with the Chanca, a powerful confederation to the west whose aggressive advances would precipitate the transformation of the highland kingdom from a regional chiefdom into an imperial power. The moment of crisis arrived when Chanca forces threatened Cusco itself around 1438 AD. According to chronicles recorded a century later, Viracocha and his designated heir, Inca Urcan, abandoned the city in the face of this threat. One prince, however, remained behind, Yupanqui, who rallied the city's defenders and achieved an unexpected victory against the Chanca. In the dramatic tellings of this pivotal battle, stones on the battlefield transformed into warriors to fight for Yupanqui, signaling divine support for his leadership. Following this miraculous victory, Yupanqui seized power, taking the regal name Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, he who remakes the world. This name would prove prophetic. Under his leadership, the modest kingdom centered on Cusco would begin its metamorphosis into Tawantinsuyu, the land of the Four Quarters, the largest indigenous empire in the Western Hemisphere. The birth of this Andean state thus emerged from a complex interweaving of mythology and history. A small highland group with unremarkable beginnings gradually developed distinctive social institutions, religious practices, and political structures that prepared them for dramatic expansion. Their origin stories, whether recounting divine emergence from sacred lakes or caves, reflected genuine cultural memories while establishing the cosmic legitimacy of their rulership. When the moment of historical opportunity arrived, triggered by external threat and internal leadership transformation, they were positioned to reimagine their place in the Andean world. As Pachacuti assumed control in Cusco, the stage was set for an unprecedented imperial project. The modest kingdom that had slowly evolved over 2 centuries was about to undergo a revolutionary transformation that would alter the social, political, and physical landscape of Western South America. From their sacred valley home, these highland people would extend their influence across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, incorporating millions from diverse cultures into a sophisticated administrative system. This remarkable expansion would build upon thousands of years of Andean cultural development, while introducing innovations in governance, infrastructure, an ideology that would leave an indelible mark on the region's history. When Pachacuti seized power in Cusco around 1438 AD, he inherited a modest kingdom of limited regional influence. Within 3 decades, he would transform this highland polity into the nucleus of the largest indigenous empire in the Americas. His name, meaning, "He who transforms the world," perfectly captured the revolutionary nature of his reign. Through military genius, administrative innovation, and religious reform, Pachacuti laid the foundations for an imperial system that would eventually encompass millions of subjects across western South America. The victory against the Chanca that catapulted him to power marked just the beginning of his military campaigns. Recognizing that the threat had not been permanently eliminated, Pachacuti first consolidated control over the immediate surroundings of Cusco. He systematically conquered the ethnic groups inhabiting the valley, incorporating their territories while reorganizing their social structures to serve the interests of the expanding state. Local leaders who submitted peacefully often retained positions of authority, though now subordinate to Cusco's hierarchy. Those who resisted faced harsher consequences, including forced resettlement and replacement by loyal administrators. After securing the Cusco Valley, Pachacuti turned his attention to the Chanca homeland. His forces crushed the Chanca Confederation in a series of decisive battles, eliminating his most dangerous rival while gaining control over valuable agricultural lands and trade routes to the west. This campaign demonstrated his strategic brilliance, not merely defeating enemies in battle, but systematically dismantling their capacity to organize future resistance. With the immediate threat neutralized, Pachacuti adopted a broader geopolitical vision. He launched campaigns against the ethnic groups inhabiting the Altiplano around Lake Titicaca to the southeast. The Kala and Lipaca, heirs to the Tiwanaku tradition, possessed rich pasture land for camel herding and controlled important trade networks with the eastern lowlands. Initial resistance gave way to incorporation into the expanding state, though periodic rebellions would continue to challenge imperial authority in this region. Pachacuti's conquest strategies revealed a sophisticated understanding of Andean political realities, rather than relying solely on military superiority. He deployed a flexible repertoire of diplomatic and coercive tactics. His emissaries would approach local leaders with offers of alliance, demonstrating the benefits of peaceful incorporation through gifts and promises of privileged status. Only when negotiation failed would military force be deployed. This approach minimized resistance while maximizing the integration of conquered populations into the imperial system. Marriage alliances formed another critical component of Pachacuti's statecraft. By arranging marriages between women of the royal lineage and leaders of newly conquered territories, he created kinship bonds that legitimized Cusco's authority while giving provincial elites a stake in the imperial project. These relationships served as conduits for cultural exchange, facilitating the dissemination of language, religious practices, and administrative techniques throughout the expanding realm. As his territorial holdings grew, Pachacuti recognized the need for comprehensive administrative restructuring. The informal governance appropriate for a small kingdom would not suffice for managing diverse populations across challenging terrain. He instituted a decimal administration system that organized subjects into units of 10, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000 households, each with appointed officials responsible for tax collection, labor mobilization, and dispute resolution. This hierarchy created clear chains of command while generating census information essential for state planning. Provincial governance required particular attention. Newly conquered territories were divided into provinces under the authority of governors, typically members of the royal lineage or proven military commanders. These officials implemented imperial policies while relaying local concerns back to Cusco. Regional administrative centers served as scaled-down versions of the capital, complete with storage facilities, ceremonial spaces, and housing for officials. This provincial infrastructure physically manifested imperial presence while facilitating resource extraction and redistribution. The MITA labor system emerged during this period as a defining feature of imperial administration. Building on Andean traditions of reciprocal labor exchange, Pachacuti systematized these practices into a state-managed institution. All able-bodied subjects owed labor service to the state for public projects, including road construction, agricultural terracing, building maintenance, and military campaigns. This obligation rotated through communities on a scheduled basis, ensuring a steady labor supply while avoiding excessive burdens on any single group. The MITA enabled massive infrastructure development, while reinforcing political allegiance through direct participation in imperial projects. Equally significant was Pachacuti's radical reimagining of Cusco itself, recognizing the propaganda value of monumental architecture. He demolished much of the existing settlement and rebuilt it as a planned imperial capital. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern resembling a puma, a sacred animal symbolizing power and authority. At the center stood Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, its interior walls covered with gold sheets that reflected sunlight in dazzling displays during ceremonial occasions. This architectural transformation physically embodied the state's growing prestige while providing appropriate settings for increasingly elaborate rituals. Beyond the capital, Pachacuti ordered the construction of administrative centers, storehouses, and temples throughout the realm. These buildings featured standardized architectural elements, trapezoidal doorways, precision-fitted stone walls, and distinctive niches, marking them unmistakably as imperial installations. Their presence on the landscape announced state authority in newly conquered regions while providing the infrastructure necessary for governance. Perhaps most impressive was Pachacuti's inauguration of the royal estate system. He established a personal estate in the Urubamba Valley, later known as Machu Picchu, as a retreat from the capital and a symbolic representation of his continuing authority even after death. Subsequent rulers would follow this precedent, each creating their own estates, supported by dedicated agricultural lands and labor from specific communities. These complexes served multiple functions, demonstrating imperial resources, providing settings for elite socialization, and establishing enduring monuments to individual rulers. Religious reforms complemented these administrative and architectural innovations, while maintaining traditional veneration of Inti, the sun deity. Pachacuti elevated this cult to the official state religion, directly connecting his lineage to divine authority. He ordered the construction of temples dedicated to Inti throughout the realm, instituting standardized rituals overseen by specialized priests. At the same time, he incorporated local deities into an expanding imperial pantheon, allowing conquered peoples to maintain traditional practices while acknowledging the supremacy of state-sponsored worship. The Sikh system exemplified this religious reorganization. From Coricancha, 41 conceptual lines radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, organizing more than 328 huacas, sacred shrines or natural features, throughout the Cusco Valley. Each Sikh line was maintained by specific kin groups responsible for making offerings at designated huacas according to a ritual calendar. This system integrated sacred geography, social organization, and calendrical observance into a unified framework controlled by the state, while incorporating diverse local traditions. Architectural and engineering innovations accelerated during Pachacuti's reign. Specialized stonemasons developed techniques for creating precisely fitted walls without mortar, particularly important in this earthquake-prone region. Some stones were shaped with slight convexity, creating walls that leaned slightly inward for enhanced stability. Construction methods varied by region and purpose: fine ashlar masonry for temples and palaces, rougher fieldstone for agricultural terraces and ordinary buildings. This flexible approach maximized available resources while maintaining necessary structural integrity across diverse environments. Agricultural engineering received particular attention. Terracing systems transformed steep hillsides into productive farmland while controlling erosion. Some terraces featured sophisticated internal drainage layers consisting of stones, gravel, and sand beneath the topsoil. Irrigation channels, often lined with cut stone, directed water from springs and streams to crops growing in naturally dry areas. These agricultural innovations increased food production while demonstrating state mastery over the challenging Andean landscape. Cultural standardization accompanied these material developments. Quechua, the language of Cusco, was promoted throughout the realm as the administrative lingua franca, facilitating communication between imperial officials and local populations. Standardized ceramic styles, textiles, and other craft products projected imperial aesthetics while showcasing technical excellence. State-sponsored festivals brought together diverse populations and shared ritual experiences that reinforced political allegiance while allowing cultural exchange between previously isolated groups. Toward the end of his reign, Pachacuti began grooming his son Tupac Yupanqui as successor. Unlike previous transitions, which often involved contestation between rival claimants, Pachacuti instituted a period of co-rule beginning around 1463. This arrangement allowed the heir to gain administrative experience while demonstrating continuity in leadership. Tupac Yupanqui led military campaigns against territories to the north, extending imperial control into what is now Ecuador, while his father maintained central administration in Cusco. When Pachacuti died around 1471, he left behind a transformed world. What had been a modest regional kingdom had become the nucleus of an expanding empire, controlling diverse populations across challenging terrain. The administrative systems, religious practices, and architectural achievements of his reign provided foundations for the further expansion that would follow under his successors. His innovations in statecraft, particularly the flexible incorporation of conquered populations and standardized provincial administration, enabled sustainable imperial growth rather than short-lived conquest. Beyond specific achievements, Pachacuti established a template for legitimate imperial rule that subsequent leaders would follow. His combination of military prowess, administrative innovation, architectural patronage, and religious reform created a comprehensive model of sovereignty appropriate for the Andean context. The world-transforming quality evoked by his regal name was no exaggeration. Through vision and pragmatism, he had fundamentally reshaped political possibilities in the Central Andes. The groundwork laid during these formative decades enabled the rapid imperial expansion that would follow. As Tupac Yupanqui assumed sole rule, he inherited not merely territories but functioning systems of governance, resource extraction, and ideological legitimation. The institutional framework created under Pachacuti would prove remarkably adaptable to new challenges as the empire continued its unprecedented growth across the mountainous landscape of western South America. The period from 1471 to 1493 AD marked the apex of territorial expansion under Tupac Yupanqui and the early years of his son's rule. During these decades, the boundaries of Toantinsuyu more than doubled, incorporating diverse populations from present-day Ecuador to Chile. This remarkable growth was accompanied by sophisticated administrative systems, monumental construction projects, and intricate social organization that together constituted the most complex political structure ever developed in pre-Columbian America. Tupac Yupanqui had already proven his military capabilities during his father's lifetime, leading campaigns into the northern highlands while Pachacuti governed from Cusco. Upon assuming sole rule, he pursued an aggressive strategy of territorial expansion in multiple directions. Unlike his father, who focused primarily on consolidating control over the Central Andes, Tupac Yupanqui envisioned a truly continental domain stretching from the equatorial regions to the southern deserts. His most significant conquest targeted the Chimu kingdom along the northern coast of present-day Peru. This sophisticated state, centered at the massive adobe city of Chan Chan, controlled rich agricultural valleys and maintained extensive trade networks along the Pacific coast. Its craftspeople created exquisite metalwork, textiles, and ceramics that symbolized elite status. Despite these achievements, the Chima kingdom fell to Highland forces after a series of campaigns between 1470 and 1475. This victory gained control over densely populated agricultural lands. Extensive irrigation works, and communities of specialized craftspeople who would now serve new masters. With the northern coast secured, Tupac Yupanqui pushed territorial boundaries even further. His forces advanced northward into what is now Ecuador, conquering the Canary and other groups in the highlands before reaching Quito. Archaeological evidence suggests they may have ventured even further north into present-day Colombia. Simultaneously, southern expeditions extended authority into what is now northern Chile and northwestern Argentina. These campaigns incorporated diverse ecological zones into the growing realm. From tropical lands to desert coasts to high-altitude plateaus. Military expansion alone cannot explain this unprecedented growth. Equally important was the development of infrastructure that enabled effective governance across vast distances and challenging terrain. The most visible manifestation was the road system, known as Kapaknan, or the Royal Road. This network eventually encompassed over 40,000 kilometers of engineered pathways connecting all regions of the domain. The main north-south highway running along the Andean spine featured paved surfaces, drainage systems, retaining walls, and stairways that facilitated movement through some of Earth's most difficult terrain. These roads served multiple purposes beyond mere transportation. At regular intervals stood tambos, way station complexes providing lodging for traveling officials, storage for supplies, and facilities for messengers. The Chaza messenger system utilized trained runners who carry verbal communications and small items in relay fashion between tambos, running at altitude. Each messenger could cover their assigned segment at remarkable speed before passing information to the next runner. Through this system, messages could travel from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,000 miles, in less than a week, an astonishing achievement in a society without riding or wheeled vehicles. A second highway paralleled the first along the coast, with connecting routes between the two main arteries. Additional roads led eastward toward the Amazon basin and westward to the Pacific. This comprehensive network facilitated the movement of armies, administrators, and goods throughout the realm while symbolizing unity across diverse landscapes. The roads physically manifested state power, their very existence demonstrating engineering prowess and organizational capacity while facilitating the practical requirements of governance. Agricultural mastery reached its zenith during this period. State-sponsored terracing projects transformed steep mountainsides across the highlands, creating level platforms for cultivation while controlling erosion. The most impressive examples, like those in the Sacred Valley near Cusco, featured precisely cut stone retaining walls supporting deep soils suitable for intensive agriculture. Internal drainage layers prevented waterlogging during heavy rains. These engineering marvels not only increased available farmland but symbolized the ruling elite's capacity to reshape landscapes according to human design. Irrigation works grew increasingly sophisticated, with canals carrying water long distances from sources in the mountains to fields in naturally arid zones. Some systems featured underground segments to reduce evaporation. Water management infrastructure included dams, reservoirs, and diversion structures that regulated flow according to seasonal needs. These hydraulic works supported intensified agriculture while demonstrating technical expertise at managing this precious resource in a challenging environment where rainfall was highly seasonal and often unpredictable. The agricultural calendar incorporated a sophisticated understanding of astronomical phenomena, observations of solstices, equinoxes, and stellar movements guided planting and harvesting schedules across different ecological zones. Officials monitored the appearance of the Pleiades constellation, whose visibility correlated with rainfall patterns crucial for agriculture. This knowledge, combined with careful record-keeping, allowed for planning at a massive scale across regions with distinct growing conditions. Perhaps the most ingenious agricultural innovation was the implementation of the vertical archipelago economic model at a grand scale. This approach exploited the dramatic altitudinal variation of the Andes, where climbing a few thousand feet could mean entering entirely different climatic zones. Communities maintained access to lands at different elevations, producing diverse crops suited to specific conditions, potatoes and other tubers at higher altitudes, maize and beans at middle elevations, cocoa and tropical fruits in lower valleys. Central administration built upon this traditional pattern, coordinating production and redistribution across ecological zones now united within a single political system. The organizational framework supporting this vast enterprise became increasingly specialized during Tupac Yupanqui's reign. The decimal administration system initiated by Pachacuti expanded to encompass new territories, with officials appointed to oversee units of population ranging from 10 households to 10,000. Local ethnic lords, known as curacas, maintained authority within their communities but now operated within the broader hierarchy. This system incorporated pre-existing social structures into an overarching administrative framework, while maintaining clear chains of command extending from village level to the capital. Record-keeping became more sophisticated with the development of the quipu system. These devices consisted of primary cords from which hung pendant strings tied into complex knots. Different knot types, positions, and string colors encoded numerical and categorical information about populations, tribute obligations, resources, and historical events. Specialized officials called quipukamaics maintained and interpreted these devices, providing administrators with detailed information necessary for governance. While not writing in the conventional sense, this system enabled precise record-keeping for a government managing millions of subjects without alphabetic or logographic script. Storage facilities constituted another critical component of societal infrastructure. Massive complexes of stone storehouses, *culcas*, were constructed throughout the realm. These structures featured ventilation systems that maintained appropriate conditions for preserving grains, dried meats, textiles, and other goods. Some complexes contained hundreds of individual storehouses, representing enormous investments in construction while demonstrating state control over vital resources. These facilities stored food reserves for times of scarcity, supplies for armies and laborers, and goods for redistribution according to centralized priorities. The economic system operated through principles of reciprocity and redistribution rather than markets or currency. Communities fulfilled tribute obligations through labor service and products specific to their ecological zones. Officials redistributed these goods throughout the realm according to administrative needs. This system enabled specialization of production while ensuring communities received necessary resources unavailable in their immediate environments. The absence of market mechanisms meant the state maintained direct control over economic activity, directing resources toward prioritized projects rather than profit-seeking by individuals. Monumental architecture flourished during this golden age. Beyond Cusco, administrative centers like Huánuco, Pampa, and Pumpu in the Central Highlands featured massive plazas capable of accommodating thousands of people for official functions and ceremonial gatherings. Their standardized layouts included administrative buildings, storage facilities, and accommodations for visiting dignitaries. These centers physically manifested central authority throughout the realm while providing necessary infrastructure for governance. Equally impressive were royal estates established by successive rulers. Following Pachacuti's example at Machu Picchu, Tupac Yupanqui created his own estate at Chinchero, while later his son would develop Quispaguanca in the Sacred Valley. These complexes served multiple functions as private retreats for the ruler, settings for elite social activities, and symbols of continuing royal authority. After a ruler's death, these estates would be maintained by his panica, the corporate descent group responsible for maintaining his mummified remains and perpetuating his memory. This practice created enduring connections between rulers, territories, and descendant groups that reinforced stability across generations. Religious architecture also expanded dramatically. Temples dedicated to Inti, the sun deity, were constructed in major centers throughout the realm. The most sacred sites featured precisely cut stone walls, carefully oriented entrances aligned with astronomical phenomena, and interior spaces designed for specific ritual functions. The site of Isla del Sol in Lake Titicaca received particular attention as a place associated with the origin myths of the ruling dynasty. These religious structures physically manifested cosmic order while providing appropriate settings for state-sponsored ceremonies that reinforced political authority. Social organization during this period reflected the increasing complexity of the administrative system. At the apex stood the living ruler, considered a direct descendant of the sun deity. Below him, a nobility comprised of royal panikas and non-royal elite administered the realm. The bulk of the population consisted of Hatanruna, ordinary subjects organized into Alis, traditional kinship groups that now functioned within the broader hierarchy. A separate category consisted of Yanakuna, individuals detached from their original communities to serve the state directly as specialized laborers, servants, or administrators. Gender complementarity characterized social organization at all levels. While men predominated in political positions, elite women exercised significant influence, particularly through the institution of secondary wives who created kinship connections between the ruling lineage and provincial elites. The highest-ranking women, known as Aklakuna or chosen women, received specialized education before being assigned to religious service, marriage to high-ranking officials, or other roles serving state interests. Their training in textile production, chicha brewing, and ritual practices supported both practical needs and symbolic functions of the government. Daily life for ordinary subjects combined traditional practices with new obligations to the central authorities. Agriculture remained the foundation of subsistence, with households cultivating crops appropriate to their ecological zones while maintaining limited herds of llamas and alpacas in highland areas. Domestic activities followed gender-specific patterns. Women typically managed food preparation, textile production, and child care, while men handled field preparation, construction, and craft production. Community-level activities included maintenance of local irrigation systems, dispute resolution through traditional mechanisms, and observance of agricultural festivals that marked the seasonal calendar. The MITA labor system continued to organize work on state projects. Communities fulfilled these obligations on a rotating basis, providing workers for construction, agricultural expansion, mining, or military service. This system distributed labor burdens across populations while accomplishing massive infrastructure projects without slave labor or paid workforces. Reciprocally, the government provided food, chicha, and ceremonial recognition during these labor drafts, acknowledging the contributions of participating communities within the ideological framework of mutual obligation. Despite its apparent stability, tensions existed within this complex system. Recently conquered territories required more direct military presence, with fortresses and garrisons ensuring compliance with central demands. Some populations were forcibly resettled as Mitmakuna. Loyal colonists moved from their home territories to regions requiring additional supervision or specialized skills. These policies acknowledged the incomplete nature of cultural integration even as administrative structures imposed standardized obligations throughout the realm. As Tupac Yupanqui's reign drew to a close around the year 1493, Tawantinsuyu had reached its maximum territorial extent. His son and successor would focus less on further expansion and more on consolidating control over recently acquired territories, particularly in the northern regions. The administrative system had achieved remarkable sophistication, managing diverse populations across challenging terrain through hierarchical governance, infrastructure development, and ideological frameworks that legitimized central authority. This golden age represented the fullest expression of Andean statecraft, building upon millennia of cultural development while implementing innovations in governance, engineering, and social organization at an unprecedented scale. The dawn of the 16th century found Tiwanaku at the height of its power. Under the leadership of the 10th sovereign, Huayna Capac, who ruled from approximately 1493 to 1525. The administrative system reached its fullest development. Yet within this seeming stability lay the seeds of catastrophe. A series of interconnected crises. Some arriving silently from across the ocean, others emerging from within the governmental structure itself, would soon shatter the carefully constructed order of the Andean world. The new ruler inherited a domain of unprecedented proportions from his father. Rather than pursuing further territorial expansion, he focused on consolidating control over recently conquered regions, particularly in the northern territories of present-day Ecuador. He established a second capital at Tambamba, modern Cuenca, Ecuador, investing enormous resources in its development as a northern counterpart to Cusco. This magnificent center featured temples, plazas, and palaces constructed with materials brought from across the realm, including stones transported from Cusco itself to symbolize the transfer of sacred authority. The sovereign's extended presence in the north reflected persistent challenges in this region. The Canary peoples had fiercely resisted incorporation, requiring multiple campaigns before their territories were secured. Even after military victory, maintaining administrative control demanded ongoing attention from the highest levels of leadership. The ruler spent much of his reign personally overseeing governance in these northern provinces, a decision that would have profound consequences for succession politics after his death. Despite these challenges, infrastructure continued to develop during this period. The road network expanded, administrative centers were constructed in newly incorporated territories, and terrace systems transformed additional landscapes for agricultural production. Storage facilities grew in size and number, creating reserves meant to sustain populations during times of scarcity. These material investments represented continuing confidence in the permanence of governmental institutions, even as unseen threats gathered on distant horizons. The first indications of impending calamity arrived via maritime contacts along the Pacific coast. Sometime around 1524, unusual vessels were reportedly sighted off the shores of Ecuador. Strange ships with billowing white cloth that seemed to move against the wind. Though no direct contact occurred during these initial sightings, they represented the first physical manifestation of European presence in the region. Spanish expeditions led by Pascual de Andagoya and later Francisco Pizarro were beginning to probe southward from their base in Panama, seeking information about wealthy lands rumored to lie along the Pacific coast of South America. More devastating than these distant explorers was an invisible threat that traveled ahead of physical European presence. Smallpox, a disease entirely unknown in the Americas before 1492, began to spread through northern portions of the Andean realm around 1524 to 1525. Having no previous exposure, and thus no immunological defenses, local populations experienced catastrophic mortality rates. The disease moved along trade routes and roads faster than any army, reaching communities that had never seen a European face. The impact proved particularly severe in densely populated administrative centers, where infections spread rapidly among concentrated populations. The demographic collapse disrupted agricultural production, labor drafts, and tribute collection throughout affected regions. Equally significant were the psychological and spiritual consequences of this inexplicable mortality, which challenged traditional understanding of illness and divine order. Many interpreted this unprecedented catastrophe as evidence of spiritual imbalance or divine disfavor, undermining confidence in established religious frameworks that legitimized central authority. Among the countless victims of this invisible invader was the sovereign himself, Huayna Capac, who reportedly died of smallpox while in the northern provinces around 1525. Even more significantly, his designated heir, Ninan Quiochi, succumbed to the same disease shortly before or after his father. This dual mortality at the highest level of leadership created an unprecedented succession crisis, with no clear procedure for resolving competing claims to power. The absence of an unambiguously designated heir opened the door to dynastic struggle. Two principal contenders emerged, each with significant bases of support within the governmental structure. One son, Huáscar, based in Cusco, claimed legitimacy through his mother's high status and his presence in the traditional capital. His half-brother, Atahualpa, who had accompanied their father in the northern campaigns, controlled military forces in Ecuador and claimed his father had designated him as successor before death. What might have remained a negotiated division of authority escalated into open warfare that would tear apart the fabric of Andean governance. Initial rounds of this conflict involved diplomatic maneuvering rather than direct military confrontation. Each contender sought to secure the loyalty of provincial governors, military commanders, and religious authorities. The southern claimant controlled the traditional instruments of legitimacy in Cusco, including important religious shrines and the support of established panicas. His northern rival commanded the loyalty of experienced military forces that had been stationed in the north under their father's direct supervision. The rivalry reflected not merely personal ambition, but genuine differences in vision for governance. Huáscar represented traditional centralization focused on Cusco, while Atahualpa embodied a more flexible approach, incorporating northern territories as full partners in the administrative project. By 1529, these tensions erupted into open civil war. Initial engagements favored the Cusco-based contender, Huáscar, whose forces pushed northward toward his rival's strongholds. However, the northern faction commanded more experienced military leaders, including Generals Quizquiz and Calcacuma, who had served during the northern campaigns. These commanders developed strategies that eventually turned the tide of conflict. After suffering early reverses, the northern forces counterattacked with devastating effectiveness, driving southward toward the traditional heartland. The civil war raged across the central Andes with unprecedented brutality. Unlike previous campaigns that typically incorporated defeated populations into the administrative structure, this internal conflict sought the complete elimination of opposing factions. Cities were sacked, agricultural systems destroyed, and water sources contaminated. Captured enemies faced execution rather than integration. This scorched earth approach inflicted lasting damage on societal infrastructure while traumatizing populations caught between competing factions. By 1532, the northern generals had achieved decisive military superiority. Huáscar was captured after his forces suffered a major defeat near Cusco. With the traditional capital now under the control of northern forces, the victorious claimant, Atahualpa, began a triumphal journey southward from Ecuador to claim his victory. Along the way, he received reports of strange bearded men who had landed on the northern coast and were moving inland. These were Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors, whose arrival coincided with the culmination of the Civil War. The northern faction's victory proved short-lived and ultimately Pyrrhic. Having eliminated his rival, Atahualpa initiated a purge of opposition supporters, particularly targeting members of rival panicas who might challenge his legitimacy. This campaign of execution decimated significant portions of the elite, eliminating potential leaders who might otherwise have mounted more effective resistance against the European interlopers. The ritual knowledge, administrative expertise, and military experience contained within these eliminated lineages represented an irreplaceable loss to Andean civilization. Beyond the human cost, the Civil War inflicted severe damage on societal infrastructure. Road segments were destroyed to impede enemy movements. Storage facilities were emptied or burned to deny resources to opposing forces. Agricultural terraces and irrigation systems suffered neglect or deliberate sabotage. These physical damages compounded the social disruption resulting from the displacement of populations fleeing conflict zones. Communities that had participated in centralized projects for generations now focused on basic survival rather than contributing to larger administrative goals. The conflict similarly disrupted the spiritual foundations of governmental legitimacy. Religious sites associated with particular rulers became targets for desecration by opposing factions. Ritual specialists aligned with different contenders promoted competing narratives about divine favor and cosmic order. The predictable progression of ceremonies marking the agricultural calendar faltered amid violence and population displacement. These disruptions undermined the ideological frameworks that had legitimized central authority while providing cosmic orientation for ordinary subjects. Communication networks throughout the Andean realm deteriorated as the conflict intensified. The Chaz messenger system, which had facilitated rapid information flow across vast distances, became unreliable as stations were abandoned or messengers intercepted by opposing forces. Without accurate intelligence about developments in different provinces, central coordination became increasingly difficult. Local officials made decisions based on limited information, often prioritizing immediate security concerns over longer-term administrative goals. The economic impact proved equally severe. Trade networks that had connected diverse ecological zones faltered amid insecurity on transportation routes. Craft specialists abandoned production centers in contested regions, resulting in decreased availability of prestige goods that had symbolized elite status and rewarded loyal service. The MITA labor system, which had mobilized workers for state projects, fragmented as communities redirected efforts toward local defense or simple survival. These economic disruptions compounded the demographic collapse already underway from epidemic disease. Most significantly, the Civil War shattered the aura of inevitability and divine sanction that had surrounded centralized governance. For generations, expansion and administrative consolidation had proceeded with apparent cosmic blessing. Now, with elites fighting among themselves and unexplainable disease decimating populations, traditional narratives about divine order seemed increasingly tenuous. This crisis of legitimacy created openings for alternative power structures and belief systems that would gain influence in the chaotic period to follow. As the victorious northern leader Atahualpa journeyed southward to claim his throne in late 1532, the domain he sought to rule had already been fundamentally weakened. Population losses from disease had disrupted the administrative system based on census figures and labor drafts. Physical infrastructure had suffered significant damage from military operations. Elite lineages that traditionally provided administrative expertise had been decimated by targeted executions. Trade networks connecting diverse ecological zones had atrophied amid transportation insecurity. Perhaps most importantly, the ideological foundations legitimizing centralized rule had been undermined by the spectacle of competing factions, each claiming divine sanction. The full extent of this societal crisis remained invisible to most participants. From their perspective, the conflict represented a painful but temporary disruption to established order. Once a clear victor emerged, they assumed governmental institutions would resume normal functioning under new leadership. Few could imagine that the entire administrative system stood on the precipice of collapse, or that a tiny band of foreign interlopers would deliver the final blow to this already weakened structure. When Francisco Pizarro and 168 Spanish companions moved inland from the coast in 1532, they entered a realm already fighting itself, a sophisticated political system whose material and ideological foundations had been severely compromised by concurrent crises. The shadows that had gathered during the preceding decade, biological, political, military, and spiritual, had created vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when confronted with an entirely new form of existential threat. As the northern victor prepared to meet these strange visitors at Cajamarca, the stage was set for one of history's most consequential encounters between civilizations. On the afternoon of November 15, 1532, in the highland town of Cajamarca, two worlds that had developed in complete isolation from each other for millennia collided with devastating consequences. Francisco Pizarro, leading a small contingent of 168 European adventurers, orchestrated one of history's most audacious military deceptions against a society that despite its recent internal struggles, still represented the most sophisticated political entity in the Americas. The path that brought these foreign interlopers to the Andean highlands began decades earlier with the European discovery of the Americas. Following Columbus' voyages and the subsequent conquest of the Aztec domain by Hernán Cortés, Iberian attention turned toward the rumored wealth of regions to the south. Francisco Pizarro, an illiterate soldier of modest background who had participated in early expeditions in Panama and Colombia, became captivated by tales of a wealthy southern civilization rich in gold and silver. Between 1524 and 1528, Pizarro led 2 exploratory voyages along the Pacific coast, gathering evidence of sophisticated societies and glimpsing impressive material wealth. Returning to his homeland in 1528, he secured royal authorization from Emperor Charles V to conquer these southern lands, grandly named New Castile, though still largely unknown to Europeans. The Capitulation de Toledo granted him the titles of governor, captain general, and adelantado of these territories. Diego de Almagro was appointed as commandant of the soon-to-be-established fortress at Tumbes. When Pizarro's third expedition landed on the northern coast in early 1532, they entered a realm already destabilized by factors entirely beyond their knowledge or making. Smallpox had decimated populations and killed key leadership figures. A brutal civil war had just concluded, leaving societal infrastructure damaged and political legitimacy fragmented. These circumstances created vulnerabilities that would prove decisive in the coming confrontation. The European force was remarkably small given its ambitious goal. Among Pizarro's 168 men were approximately 62 mounted soldiers, 106 foot soldiers, and perhaps 30 crossbows and arquebuses. This modest contingent was supplemented by local allies and interpreters, including coastal peoples who harbored resentments against recent Andean domination of their regions. Most notable among these was Felipillo, a young man from Tumbes, who had learned European languages during earlier expeditions and would serve as the primary translator during crucial negotiations. As the newcomers advanced inland, they benefited enormously from the recently constructed royal highway system. The very infrastructure built to maintain central authority now facilitated its undoing, allowing the foreigners to move rapidly through challenging terrain. At regular intervals, they encountered tambos stocked with provisions and staffs of local workers obligated to assist travelers on official business. Many provincial officials, uncertain about political dynamics after the Civil War, treated the strangers as authorized visitors rather than hostile invaders. Meanwhile, the victorious northern leader, Atahualpa, was making his way southward toward Cusco following his triumph over his brother Huáscar. Resting at the hot springs near Cajamarca, he received reports about the strange bearded men advancing from the coast. Rather than viewing them as an existential threat, he apparently regarded them as a minor curiosity that could be evaluated and addressed while continuing his journey to claim the traditional capital. This misjudgment, understandable given the tiny size of the foreign force relative to his military resources, would prove catastrophic. Through messengers, Atahualpa granted the foreigners permission to visit him at Cajamarca, possibly intending to incorporate these exotic visitors into traditional diplomatic protocols or perhaps planning to demonstrate his power before either eliminating or accommodating them. The Europeans, meanwhile, recognized their extreme vulnerability despite their technological advantages of steel weapons, horses, and gunpowder. Their only viable strategy was bold deception rather than open conflict against numerically superior forces. Upon reaching Cajamarca on November 15th, the expedition found the town largely emptied of regular inhabitants, with Atahualpa and his substantial retinue encamped on nearby hills. Pizarro sent an envoy led by Hernando de Soto to formally invite the Andean sovereign to meet the foreign representatives. This initial encounter provided crucial intelligence about the size and organization of Atahualpa's entourage, while demonstrating the intimidating effect of horses on people who had never encountered such animals. Atahualpa agreed to visit the foreigners the following day. apparently planning to arrive with a substantial but unarmed escort as befitting a diplomatic occasion. The Europeans, however, prepared an elaborate trap. They positioned their limited forces around the central plaza of Cajamarca, concealing cavalry units inside buildings while stationing men with crossbows and firearms at strategic points. Pizarro instructed Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde to approach Atahualpa with a breviary and demand submission to Christianity and recognition of European sovereignty. The fateful encounter unfolded on the afternoon of November 16. Atahualpa entered the plaza accompanied by several thousand attendants carrying ornamental weapons but unprepared for actual combat. The foreigners remained hidden as Friar Valverde approached the sovereign, offering a breviary while delivering a prepared speech about Christian doctrine and Castilian imperial authority. According to European accounts, Atahualpa examined the book, holding it to his ear as if expecting it to speak, before throwing it to the ground in apparent disdain. This action, or perhaps some predetermined signal regardless of Atahualpa's response, triggered the ambush. At Pizarro's command, artillery and firearms discharged into the crowded plaza, while cavalry units burst from concealed positions. The psychological impact of horses, gunpowder weapons, and steel swords against a crowd unprepared for violence created immediate panic. Within minutes, thousands of Atahualpa's retinue lay dead or wounded, while the sovereign himself was captured alive, reportedly protected from harm on Pizarro's direct orders. The speed and completeness of this victory stunned both sides. With their leader captured, Andean forces outside the town, potentially numbering many thousands, failed to mount an effective counterattack. The invaders had executed one of history's most consequential military coups, decapitating the leadership of an entire society while suffering negligible casualties themselves. Through a combination of audacity, deception, psychological warfare, and technological advantage, a minute force had effectively neutralized an entire governmental apparatus. Recognizing his value as a hostage, Atahualpa quickly offered an extraordinary ransom for his release. According to European accounts, he indicated a room and promised to fill it once with gold and twice with silver within 2 months if permitted to live. Whether this offer originated from the captive himself or was suggested by his captors remains uncertain. But the resulting collection of precious metals represented one of history's greatest transfers of wealth between civilizations. Over the following months, gold and silver objects flowed into Cajamarca from temples, palaces, and shrines across the realm. Messengers carrying Atahualpa's commands traveled throughout the land, instructing local authorities to send precious metals to ransom their sovereign. Religious treasures, architectural decorations, and ceremonial objects of incalculable artistic and cultural value were melted down into ingots for easier division among the Europeans. The ultimate collection, before melting, reportedly filled a room measuring approximately 22 feet long by 17 feet wide to a height of over 8 feet. This massive transfer of wealth, estimated at 1,420 pounds of 22-karat gold and twice that amount of silver, fundamentally undermined the material foundations of Andean spiritual and political authority. Beyond their monetary value, these objects had embodied connections between ruling lineages, deities, and cosmic order. Their destruction represented not merely economic loss, but the dismantling of physical manifestations of legitimate authority and spiritual power that had unified diverse populations across the realm. Despite fulfilling his ransom obligation, Atahualpa's fate had likely been decided from the moment of his capture. As European reinforcements arrived and the initial ransom was distributed, Pizarro found himself with a dangerous prisoner whose continued existence served no further strategic purpose. Moreover, reports that loyalist forces were gathering to rescue Atahualpa created additional urgency for eliminating this potent symbol of legitimate authority. In July 1533, after a show trial on fabricated charges of fomenting rebellion, practicing idolatry, and committing fratricidal violence against Huáscar, Atahualpa was sentenced to death by burning. Upon converting to Christianity at the last moment, likely seeking to avoid the destruction of his body through fire, which would prevent proper mummification and ancestral veneration. His sentence was commuted to execution by garrote. With his death on July 26, the last independent sovereign of Tawantinsuyu perished. Though the struggle for control of the Andean world was far from over. Following Atahualpa's execution, Pizarro installed a series of puppet rulers to legitimize foreign authority while advancing toward Cusco. First, Tupac Hualpa, another son of Huayna Capac, selected for his willingness to cooperate, was installed as a figurehead. When he died shortly thereafter, possibly poisoned by Calcacuma, one of Atahualpa's generals still resisting European control, he was replaced by Manco Inca, a son of Huayna Capac from a Cusco lineage opposed to Atahualpa's faction. The European advance on Cusco encountered significant resistance from loyalist forces led by General Quizquiz. But technological advantages combined with support from local allies eventually secured victory. On November 15, 1533, exactly 1 year after arriving at Cajamarca, Pizarro's forces entered Cusco, the sacred capital and ceremonial heart of the Andean world. The final military obstacle to foreign control had been overcome, though cultural resistance would continue for decades. Upon reaching Cusco, the newcomers encountered wealth that dwarfed even what they had already seized at Cajamarca. The city's temples, particularly Coricancha, with its gold-covered walls and life-size gold and silver replicas of crops and animals, contained treasures accumulated over generations. Once again, precious artworks and ceremonial objects were melted down for distribution among the conquerors. Buildings were systematically stripped of precious decorations, and graves were opened to extract funeral goods made of valuable materials. European control expanded rapidly during the following year. In January 1535, Pizarro founded Ciudad de los Reyes, later called Lima, as a European capital near the coast. This location reflected foreign strategic priorities, proximity to maritime connections with Panama and the Old World, and distance from highland populations that might threaten colonial control. The establishment of this coastal administrative center began a geographical reorientation of power that would permanently alter Andean economic and political patterns. The technological advantages that enabled the initial military victories were complemented by biological factors beyond either side's comprehension. European diseases continued to devastate local populations, unprotected by inherited or acquired immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus moved through communities faster than foreign forces themselves, often depopulating regions before Europeans physically arrived. Contemporary accounts describe abandoned villages and unburied bodies along travel routes, testament to the invisible conquest that accompanied military subjugation. Equally significant for the long-term transformation of Andean society were the four-legged invaders that accompanied human conquerors. Horses provided tactical advantages in warfare and symbols of foreign prestige. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats introduced new sources of protein, but also new patterns of land use that would eventually transform highland ecologies. European crops such as wheat and barley, while increasing dietary diversity, similarly required agricultural techniques that often proved less sustainable in mountain environments than traditional practices. The encomienda system was quickly established as the primary mechanism for controlling newly conquered populations. This institution granted individual Europeans the right to demand labor and tribute from specific communities, ostensibly in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, this arrangement institutionalized exploitation while disrupting traditional patterns of reciprocity and resource allocation that had governed local economies. Many communities faced overlapping demands from encomenderos, missionaries, and remnants of the indigenous nobility, creating unsustainable burdens. Religious transformation proceeded simultaneously with economic and political changes. Dominican, Franciscan, and Augustinian missionaries accompanied and followed military forces, establishing churches and initiating conversion efforts. Catholic sacraments were introduced as replacements for traditional ceremonies, while Christian saints were promoted as acceptable objects of devotion in place of traditional huacas and deities. Church construction often proceeded directly atop local sacred sites, physically and symbolically asserting the new spiritual order. This initial phase of conquest, however, faced significant countercurrents. The foreign forces, though technologically superior, remained numerically insignificant compared to Andean populations. Political control depended heavily on manipulating existing authority structures, particularly through puppet rulers who legitimized foreign actions while communicating demands to local populations. As these accommodations broke down, resistance intensified, revealing the incomplete nature of the European victory. Administrative conflicts among the conquerors further complicated consolidation of control. Diego de Almagro, who had co-financed the expedition with Pizarro but arrived after the initial triumph at Cajamarca, received a separate grant to conquer territories to the south, creating jurisdictional disputes that would eventually erupt into open civil war among European factions. These internal conflicts created openings for local resistance while demonstrating that foreign solidarity was far from absolute. Most significantly, Manco Inca, initially installed as a cooperative figurehead, grew increasingly disillusioned with foreign rule. After suffering personal humiliation and witnessing the systematic destruction of sacred sites and traditional authority structures, he escaped from Cusco in 1536 and organized the most substantial counteroffensive against European control. A massive rebellion that would fundamentally challenge the apparent finality of the conquest. The initial phase of European intrusion thus established patterns that would characterize Andean experience for centuries to come: technological change, religious transformation, economic exploitation, demographic collapse, and persistent resistance against external domination. The sophisticated administrative system built over generations by Andean rulers had been decapitated but not fully replaced. Traditional beliefs had been challenged but not eliminated. A new order was emerging from the collision of civilizations, but its ultimate form remained uncertain as both sides adapted to unprecedented circumstances. From the European perspective, the conquest represented an extraordinary success. A tiny force had overcome one of the world's most sophisticated polities, securing fabulous wealth while extending political and religious authority over vast territories. From an Andean perspective, however, the story was far from concluded. Despite catastrophic losses, demographic, material, and cultural, significant elements of traditional society remained intact, ready to resist, adapt, or accommodate as circumstances required. The shadow of foreign domination had fallen across the Andes, but local light would continue to flicker and sometimes flame brightly in the years to come. The European conquest of the Andean world was neither as swift nor as complete as the dramatic events at Cajamarca might suggest. In April 1536, less than 4 years after Pizarro's fateful ambush, a massive rebellion erupted that nearly reversed the foreign victory. This uprising, led by Manco Inca, marked the beginning of 4 decades of organized resistance that would preserve elements of traditional authority while forcing the European colonizers to recognize the limits of their control over Andean populations. Manco's path from collaboration to resistance reflected the deteriorating relationship between the European conquerors and the native nobility. Initially installed as a friendly figurehead after Atahualpa's execution, Manco had cooperated with Pizarro's forces during the occupation of Cusco, even providing military assistance against holdout forces loyal to Atahualpa's generals. In return, he expected to maintain meaningful authority within the traditional framework of reciprocal obligations that had characterized Andean governance for generations. Reality proved harshly different. Foreign encomenderos showed little respect for either Manco's royal status or Andean cultural practices. The young sovereign faced repeated humiliations, including imprisonment for failing to produce gold on demand. Most egregiously, the newcomers sexually abused women of the royal household, including Manco's own wives and sisters. These violations of fundamental social norms demonstrated that European recognition of his authority was purely nominal, a convenient fiction until direct colonial control could be established. Recognizing the true nature of his position, Manco secretly organized resistance while maintaining a facade of cooperation. During Holy Week observations in 1536, when many colonists were engaged in religious activities, he requested permission to leave Cusco briefly to retrieve a golden statue of his father. Once beyond foreign surveillance, he immediately began mobilizing a massive army, sending messengers throughout the central Andes to summon forces loyal to traditional authority. The response exceeded even European fears. Within weeks, Manco had assembled a force estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, drawn from multiple ethnic groups across the former realm. This coalition, temporarily setting aside local differences in the face of foreign domination, surrounded Cusco in May 1536 and laid siege to the colonial stronghold. Simultaneously, another substantial force descended on the newly established capital at Lima, creating a coordinated offensive against the primary centers of European control. The siege of Cusco nearly succeeded in eliminating the foreign presence in the Andean heartland. Manco's forces captured the fortress of Sacsayhuaman overlooking the city. Using it as a base for devastating attacks, they systematically destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and intercepted supply columns to isolate the approximately 190 European defenders. Using flaming arrows and torches, they set fire to Cusco's thatched roofs, burning much of the city while forcing the foreigners to retreat to the central plaza. For nearly 10 months, the colonizers faced imminent destruction, saved only by their stone-building fortifications, superior weapons, and desperate cavalry sorties to secure food.